Good day. Today is Saturday, 23rd August 2025, and before I start with my video, a brief announcement. As those of you who follow my programs closely will know, over the last 2 weeks, first my wife, Catherine, was away in Mexico City, attending an academic conference, and perhaps also, it's fair to say, giving herself a little time off. Then over the last week, my childcarer also went on leave. This weekend is a long weekend in Britain. Monday is a public holiday, and I've taken the decision that it's time for me to give myself some time off. And of course, in my case, I will be taking my family, my wife and my children, and my dogs, by the way, with me to the country. I will continue to make programs whilst I am there. I will be back in London on Monday, but the programs will inevitably be shorter, as today's program is going to be. Anyway, with that, let me now turn immediately to the events of the program today, the things I want to cover today, as I said, rather more briefly than other programs, than is common in other programs. Over the last 24 hours, the United States, the President, the White House have attempted to clarify both the meaning of his Truth Social post, the Truth Social post, which I discussed at length yesterday, and also to give a sense of where the President himself appears to be appears to believe that the diplomatic initiatives that he launched roughly 3 weeks ago, when he sent Steve Witkoff to Moscow, which resulted in 2 big meetings, one with Putin in Alaska, the other with Zilinski and the European leaders in the White House, where those initiatives are going. So the first thing the President said, or rather his officials have said, is that the Truth Social post is being overinterpreted. It did not contain any intended or implied threats against the Russians. It was purely a criticism of Joe Biden, who took steps which in effect put Ukraine in an impossible no-win position. I sort of believe that. I made the point in my program yesterday that the Truth Social post could be read in all kinds of ways, and one of them certainly was as a criticism of Biden, and the other as an implicit warning to Ukraine that it is eventually going to lose the war. And essentially, that is what the administration, the White House, is now telling us. But I do think that there was some degree of warning against Russia implicit in some of these words. And the President, surprise, surprise, has in fact made rather more explicit warnings against Russia since those comments, that guidance that was provided by the White House. He now says that he believes that it will be in about 2 weeks that we will get a better sense of the direction events are taking, and he has again floated once more the idea that if things don't go as he wants, sanctions and tariffs against Russia might indeed be imposed. And then, of course, he qualified that in the same set of comments by saying that he did expect, or he did think that Putin himself might attend the World Cup, perhaps opening up the possibility of a further meeting between Putin and Trump. I have to say that these comments seem to me to be completely all over the place. I think there was, as I said, an implicit warning in the Truth Social post. I think there undoubtedly was genuine criticism, sincere criticism of Joe Biden. And I do think there was a warning to Ukraine. But I think that Trump still hopes that the Russians might make more concessions than they seem minded to do in order to move the process along. And I think his comments about sanctions and tariffs really sort of lead into that. I would say that making comments of that kind appears to me to be a mistake. In a recent live stream that we did with him, Glenn Deason and myself, which you can find on the Duran, Professor Mearsheimer correctly said that President Trump has a tendency to throw a bone to his neocon critics. And he's just done that again. He did that during the meeting with Zilinski and the European leaders in the White House, and in the previous telephone conversation he had with them on the Wednesday before his meeting with Putin on Friday. He brought up over the course of those meetings, both the telephone call and the meeting with Zelensky and the Europeans, the whole question of security guarantees. And this has taken off an extremely dangerous life, which can only cause him problems in the future, given that the Russians have made absolutely clear, as I've discussed in several programs now, that they are dead against the kind of security guarantees that the Ukrainians and the Europeans are talking about. That is one. And secondly, the president has now again given a bone to the dogs by refloating the idea of sanctions and tariffs, which of course they're going to seize on. And more likely than not, sometime in September, we're going to see Blumenthal and Graham come back. They're going to try to revive their bill in the Senate. They're going to tell the president that his diplomatic initiative has run into the ground, that it is the Russians who are being obstructive, and they're going to start to insist that he goes ahead and imposes those tariffs and those sanctions, which he again appears to be threatening the Russians with. There are lots of explanations and assessments of why Trump seems to veer from one position to another on this. There's some views that he's trying to trick the Russians into some kind of compromise, some kind of freezing of the conflict, though by now it ought to be obvious that that isn't going to happen. And at the Alaska summit, it was he who conceded that there will not be a ceasefire, which, as I said, is the only substantive agreement so far to have come out of all of these discussions. There is a different view that he's trying to play a very complicated game, keeping his opponents in Washington in particular off balance, giving them the impression that he's ultimately going to tilt to their side, even as he works to improve long-term relations with the Russians. My own view, I've said it already, is that I think this is a president who finds it difficult to make a straightforward decision and to stick with it, and who, as a result, can be pushed in different directions, some of which work out against his long-term interests. Anyway, that's a discussion which I'm not going to spend more time talking about in this program. Now, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has now given another big interview, this time to the American media. He basically said nothing new, nothing that he has not said over the course of the two press conferences, the one with the Jordanian Foreign Minister and the one with the Indian foreign minister, and the interview that he gave to the Russian media, all of which I have discussed in exhaustive length in various programs which I have already made. But it is an interesting fact in itself that Lavrov, that the Russians decided that in order to put all of these various issues beyond all doubt, an interview with the American media was also necessary. Anyway, suffice to say, Lavrov again made it absolutely clear that the kind of security guarantees the Europeans and the Ukrainians are demanding are simply not on the table. The Russians will never agree to security guarantees like that. And as I've pointed out in program after program, given that it's absolutely obvious that the Americans and the Europeans do not want to fight Russia, they are never going to give Ukraine these kind of security guarantees if the Russians say no. And that means that the Russians have a veto over this whole process. So Lavrov made that absolutely clear. Lavrov also said that a meeting between Zilinski and Putin is not on the cards at the present time, that such a meeting needs to be organized carefully in advance, that there needs to be careful preparation, there needs to be a framework agreement before such a meeting can take place, and we are nowhere close to that point yet. And that's absolutely correct, by the way, just to say. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, I have gradually come round to the view that a lot of the confusion about what the Russians are supposed to have agreed to in connection with security guarantees, for example, they were clearly talking about the security guarantees in the Istanbul Agreement, whereas the Americans may have come away from the meeting thinking that the Russians were talking about something quite different, and the Russian belief that the Americans were prepared to discuss the general security architecture in Europe, which I don't believe the Americans currently are, and the vexed question of transfers of territory and of the Russians agreeing to a ceasefire if the Ukrainians agree to withdraw from Donbass. We'll come to that in a moment, but I've already pointed out that there is a contradiction with the Russians going to the meeting in Alaska, apparently intending to explain to the Americans that a ceasefire at this time is not the right way, and then simultaneously proposing a ceasefire if the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass. Anyway, a lot of this confusion, a lot of this muddle is because the meeting in Alaska was arranged in part in secret and overall in a hurry, and the two sides, the Americans and the Russians, went into the meeting without fully understanding the stance and position that the other was going to take. And in light of this, I think it's even more important, given the fact that Ukraine and Russia are in conflict, and given what a volatile personality Vladimir Zelensky is, I think it's even more important that any meeting between Putin and Zelensky, in whatever format, is prepared very carefully in advance. And I am sure that Lavrov is right, the Russians are right, when they say that we are far from ready for such a meeting at the present time. Anyway, Lavrov actually went on to make the point that when the Americans spoke to Zelensky at the meeting in the White House, Zelensky made it absolutely clear that he's not prepared to concede on any point at all. He's not prepared to concede on NATO, on security guarantees, on the rights of Russians in Ukraine, on territory. He's not prepared to withdraw from any territory at all. He's not prepared to retreat to discuss land swaps. He's not prepared to agree to any limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. He is taking, ultimately, a completely uncompromising position. He is sticking to that concession, that one concession that the Americans extracted from him and from the Ukrainians in March, which they only managed to do by withholding military supplies and intelligence, something that they only did for a week. And that is that there should be a ceasefire along the existing conflict line, with the conflict in effect frozen indefinitely thereafter. And Lavrov went on to say that the Russians, by contrast, had shown a degree of flexibility. They'd shown that they were ready to discuss things with the Americans, including issues of territory. But I noticed that he was very careful to say that the Russians had not actually come to any agreements on this issue. And that reinforces my view. And I think anybody who reads Lavrov's words carefully and listens to what he said carefully, that reinforces my view that the proposal that there be a ceasefire if the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass came from the Americans, and that the Russians said that they would be prepared to consider it and would be flexible about it if the Ukrainians agreed. Lavrov's point was that the Ukrainians did not agree. Zilinski rejected everything. And by the way, Lavrov is absolutely right. That is the other thing to say about the diplomacy of the last 2 weeks. There's been a concrete agreement between the Americans and the Russians, which is that there's not going to be a ceasefire, that there's going to be instead moves towards a final settlement of the conflict through a negotiation. That is one. But the other thing that came out clearly from the meetings that took place in Washington specifically is that Zilinski and his European backers are not prepared to concede on anything. They're not prepared to recognize that the Russians control any Ukrainian territory. They're not prepared to accept that this is lost and to cede it to Russia de jure. They're not prepared to accept any restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. They're not prepared to make any changes to the existing Ukrainian laws, suppressing or banning use of the Russian language in certain places. By the way, I was informed, I've heard that over the last year or so, despite all of these legal restrictions, there has been a significant increase again in the use of Russian in Ukrainian-controlled territory. The laws may have been passed, but people are increasingly ignoring them. This is obviously anecdotal information. Make of it what you will. But the point is that Zilinski is not prepared to concede on that. He's not prepared to concede on security guarantees. He made statements after the Russians provided their clarification, categorically rejecting security guarantees of the kind that the Russians and the Ukrainians both agreed to in the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022, security guarantees given by China, Russia, other states friendly to Russia, security guarantees that would give the guarantors, including, of course, Russia, veto rights over the deployment of foreign forces in Ukraine. He refused all of those things. All that he is prepared to concede is what he conceded back in March, that the Russians could continue to occupy the territory they presently hold in eastern Ukraine, but on an informal, temporary basis, until eventually Ukraine reacquires all of this territory, including Crimea, as a result of whatever geopolitical or historical change eventually takes place. Now, I cannot imagine that the Russians would agree to a deal on this kind. And I think suggestions that have been made by some that the Russians might accept a situation where Ukraine remains outside NATO but receives these kind of security guarantees, the sort that Zilinski is talking about, from the West, and that for the Russians it is territory that is the most important thing. I think all of this completely misunderstands the Russian position, and again is not listening carefully to what Russian officials, including Putin himself, but now extensively Lavrov, are saying. The Russians say the most important thing is not territory. It is Russian security, the security of Russia as a state, and the security of Russians as Russians living on their historical territory in what was and might in some places in the future continue to be Ukraine. Again, unless this is accepted and understood, we are not going to get a settlement of this conflict. Nonetheless, and in spite of that, I don't agree with a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, which sort of implies that the entire peace initiative has essentially stalled, that in fact it's gone further than that, that it is indeed unraveling, and that nothing useful has been achieved by the interactions between the Russians and the Americans over the last 3 weeks. It seems to me that, and I will repeat this again, that with the issue of a ceasefire taken off the table, even if in the future someone in the United States, including Trump himself, perhaps tries to revive it, it seems to me that with the issue of a ceasefire taken off the table, the only game in town now are the negotiations, the substantive negotiations currently continuing in Istanbul. And given that Ukraine is losing the war and will continue to lose it, it is not impossible that some kind of final settlement might come out of those negotiations in the course of time. That will not happen soon. It will not happen over the next couple of weeks. It will probably not happen until there is a military crisis in Donbass, which even Ukraine and the Western powers can no longer deny. But it does seem to me as if a seed has been planted over the last 3 weeks, which might just possibly bear fruit. Now, that brings me to the military situation. And before I proceed with the discussion of the military situation, I want briefly to return to the topic of that enormous leak from the General Staff, or alleged leak from the General Staff, which I've touched on in previous programs and which has been discussed extensively over the internet. Now, I am not in a position to assess the reliability of the documents produced by the leak. I have seen some people, including, for example, Professor Ivan Kachanovsky, the man who has exposed many of the untruths that have been said, for example, about the shootings on Maidan Square during the crisis, the political crisis in February 2014. Anyway, Professor Kachanovsky believes that this leak is fabricated, that it's concocted, that it's a fake, that it's almost certainly the work of Russian intelligence, that it is Russian propaganda. He has provided his own assessments of Ukrainian losses. He believes that Ukraine has suffered roughly 160 to 200,000 deaths, which is a huge number, by the way, over the course of the conflict, and that the numbers given in this leak are far too high and potentially exceed the total number of the Ukrainian military. And anything that Professor Kachanovsky says, and I consider him to be a very serious and reliable scholar, I take extremely seriously indeed. The same view has been expressed by others. Big Serge, for example, who writes very much about the conflict from a Russian point of view, tends to be more on the Russian than the Ukrainian side. I don't think anybody would challenge that, including Big Serge. Anyway, he too doesn't believe these numbers and is skeptical. In fact, is openly scornful of the reliability of this leak. Simplicius the thinker, by contrast, challenges some of the premises that these skeptics have brought to this discussion. He's pointed out that if you see this as part of a churn, that the total figures, which I'm still not going to give, by the way, talk about killed, severely wounded, and disappeared, which could include deserters. And if you look at recruitment levels into the Ukrainian military, the numbers that have been provided in this leak could actually be correct. He said that he doesn't endorse it himself. He doesn't know for a fact that it is true. He himself has some doubts about it, but he thinks that some of the skeptics, like Kachanovsky and Big Serge, are in too much of a hurry to dismiss it. It must be said that the leak does purport to provide a lot of granular information about the losses, but I've seen it suggested that AI programs could now actually reproduce this information without too much difficulty. So perhaps we shouldn't go too far in accepting it. Well, I'm going to say something now, which is that someone I know and who I have strong confidence in, and who has been contacted by various other agencies, and I'm not going to say anything more about that, but somebody who others have confidence in as well, has been asked to and has been looking at this leak and these figures, and has provided, anyway, his own assessment of a limited part of the leak that he has seen and that he's examined. And he has discovered that there are some cases when soldiers who have been identified in this leak as killed have indeed turned out alive, but there are possible explanations. And even if this leak is true, it might be the case that errors in the original documents, the General Staff's errors, the General Staff, as it was collating the document, errors might have seeped in. In other cases, when there's been attempts to follow through by checking on some of the identified individuals mentioned in these documents and to see whether they are real people or were real people and to trace what has happened to them. And this obviously is work which requires extensive resources, and I'm not going to discuss what those resources are, but this person has been utilizing those resources, and I'm not going to discuss that in any way. Anyway, it turns out that the information stands up. Individuals identified are turning out to exist, and that does tend to lend some reliability to this information. Now, I've also said that it doesn't seem to me completely implausible, based on those two samples of known and identifiable Russian casualties and Ukrainian casualties that I have previously been provided by coincidence over the last 2 weeks. Now, I am not myself going to come down on any side here because I am not looking at this information myself. It would be impossible for me to. I just don't have the time, and I don't have these kind of resources, and given my eyesight issues and the problems in language, I cannot second guess them myself. But somebody who I know is reliable and is judged to be reliable by well-informed third parties, and who has looked at samples of this leak, is starting to say that the information overall looks as if it could be legit. Now, that is not to deny that the source of this information, the proximate source of this information, is probably Russian intelligence. I know that one person I've been in contact with has been in contact with one of the hacking groups involved in conducting this hack. Not all of the people involved in it, by the way, are Russians, just to say. But it is not impossible, and this person accepts that it is not impossible that this hacking group is working for Russian intelligence. I believe that Russian intelligence is indeed behind this hack, and has, if there was a hack, and is behind the publication of this information. So, as I said, take it all with a very big pinch of salt. There is a serious question of provenance there. But, as I said, somebody who I consider reliable has looked at these documents and does think that there may be some factual accuracy there. I mean, so far, based on research that has been done on a small fraction of these documents, they're turning out to be overall reasonably factually true. Now, it needs to be said that this big number that people have been hearing, it does not speak of people who have just been killed. It speaks of people who've been killed and wounded and who've gone missing. Ukraine is known to have a major desertion problem. It's been discussed extensively in the Ukrainian media as well. So don't treat this figure in the way that some people are doing, as giving one a sense of the total number of people who have been killed. It is not. It does not say that, and it's likely that the actual number of people killed is substantially less, very much less, than the headline number that has been circulating in some places might lead people to think. Though the overall numbers are still appallingly high. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this topic. I am possibly going to return to it again. I've been going back a couple of weeks ago. I was provided with information, obtained calculations and assessments of casualties. I mentioned this in a previous program. I've been sifting through them again. And again, I have to say, and these are entirely independent of this information. Again, I know the source, the person who's been collating and, well, persons who have been collating and who have been making these assessments. And I can say definitely that they are not in any way connected with the Russian authorities, just to make that very clear. But again, they are not at variance. those are estimates, but they are not at variance with the information provided, or at least in sharp variance with the information provided from this league. Now, let's move on. Having said all of this rather complicated discussion, let's talk about the military situation. And I think there's a number of things clearly to say here, which is that the Russian offensive is intensifying. And that has become very clear over the last few hours. I spoke yesterday about how the Russians have captured the two important villages of Rusin Yar and Vladimirovka, northeast of Pokrovsk, how they are widening the hole that they have punched into Pokrovsk. The Russian news agency TASS is now claiming that there are 3,000 Ukrainian troops trapped south of the Kliban-Bik reservoir, in the area of the village of Kliban-Bik and in the fields and woods around it, that they have no escape route, and that at the moment they are refusing to surrender, and that the Russians are in fact obliged to hunt them down. Andrei Marochko, our old friend, is now denying reports from the Ukrainians that the Russians have been pushed out of Konstantinovka. He says that the Russians are indeed in Konstantinovka itself and have established a foothold there. And I've been hearing more reports about continued fighting in Pokrovsk itself. There is an operational crisis that the Ukrainians are facing in the southern arc of these towns, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka. The two southernmost of these towns, or westernmost of these towns, Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, are now under immense pressure. There are parallels being drawn by some about the situation in Konstantinovka with the early weeks of the Battle of Toretsk, when the Russians were able to break into Toretsk and to push hard through Toretsk and to capture large parts of it before Ukrainian resistance started to stiffen in the northern parts of Toretsk, though even then it's a misconception, in my opinion, that the battle for Toretsk and for the entire conurbation for Toretsk actually lasted that long. But there are suggestions that the Russians are conducting a storming operation in Konstantinovka, similar to the one that they conducted in Toretsk. My own view is that Pokrovsk, the Battle of Pokrovsk, is being used by the Russians to bleed the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainians had to rush reserves to hold the Russians back. In Pakrovsk, there are multiple reports now, including from the Ukrainians, that their reserves, their best brigades, are being bombed and attacked by the Russians, by the Rubicon Group and its drones, by the Russian Air Force in the fields, by the special forces that are running amok, Russian special forces that are running amok in Pakrovsk itself and also in the fields nearby. Whilst at the same time, the Russians are enlarging this breakthrough that they have achieved, and that at some point within the next couple of weeks, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, they will move finally and decisively to cut the various roads leading both into Pakrovsk and Konstantinovka itself, and we could very quickly see a major encirclement operation, a cauldron, start to develop in this area. And then I think the fact that Ukraine is facing an operational crisis in Donbass will become impossible to deny. There are reports in the media in the United States that President Trump has told his officials that he believes that Ukraine is going to lose the war, that he has found that the settlement of the crisis has turned out to be much more complicated than he expected, and that nonetheless, sooner or later, because Ukraine is losing the war, Ukraine will have to capitulate to Russia and accept Russian terms, mostly Russian terms. These are unofficial reports, but Trump himself has come out and publicly said that he does not want to be involved personally in any meeting between Putin and Zilinski, which also suggests that he wants to distance himself from what is, I suspect, already a shaping crisis in Donbass. All of this should be seen in the context of reports which have also appeared, in fact they appeared a few days ago, that some US officials, I'm going to make a guess, Pete Hegseth, maybe, are becoming frustrated by Ukrainian intransigence, by the Ukrainian refusal to countenance any retreats, even from Donbass, even as a military disaster for the Ukrainian army in Donbass is currently playing out. And it could be that when we do finally get to that point, when Konstantinovka and Pakrovsk are both surrounded, perhaps Siversk as well, who's to say. Siversk, as I discussed in my program yesterday, is now very close indeed to being surrounded. The Russians are well to the west of Siversk. In fact, Siversk is well inside, deep inside, a salient, and there is only one small funnel through which the Ukrainians could send supplies to it. It seems to me that logically the Ukrainians ought to be pulling out of Siversk and ought to have done so long ago. Anyway, that's another story. It could be that when all of these crises simultaneously hit, we will then finally see the United States take further diplomatic action and lean on the Ukrainians finally to accept the outcome of the war and to accept a resolution of the war on Russian terms. I have to say, I don't myself think that's going to happen, even if the Ukrainians lose Donbass, even if Ukrainian public sentiment leans strongly in that direction. I still believe that Zelensky himself will never agree to any settlement of the conflict on any terms that would be acceptable to Russia, or on the kind of terms that the Russians are proposing, on terms that might be described as Istanbul Plus. Now, at this point, I'm going to express my own puzzlement, slight puzzlement, about one thing, which is that if Trump really does think that, he's expressed public skepticism about sanctions and tariffs, secondary tariffs and all of that. Apparently this has been said in private now by lots of American and even European officials, that this isn't going to work. Ursula von der Leyen and the Europeans might be obsessed with this idea, and it was Zilinski is, but the sanctions and tariffs are not going to work. In fact, Putin has just had a meeting with the Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, and the Indians and the Russians have now announced a plan to increase their mutual trade to a $100 billion level within a short time. In other words, to double it from where it is at present, which I think would mean, by the way, that trade between Russia and India would start to close in on the level of American-Indian trade, just to say. But anyway, apparently European and American officials acknowledge that sanctions and tariffs are not going to work. Trump himself saw exactly what Lavrov is saying over the course of the meeting in Washington, how completely intransigent Zilinski is. So why is he just saying that he's going to distance himself from the negotiations? Why doesn't he just walk away from them? Maybe saying he's going to distance himself from the diplomacy is his way of saying that he's going to walk away. But he does that even at the same time as he throws bones to the neocon dogs by still reviving the idea of tariffs and sanctions. He's making more problems for himself, I think, than he needs to do. And I think that is a mistake. Anyway, there it is. That's the line that the president has decided to take. Now, I'm going to finish by saying that even as America seems to be trying to walk away from the conflict in Ukraine, it continues to be immersed in conflicts in other places. The situation in the Middle East remains as terrible as always, and the Iranians, as Alex Christopher and I have discussed in a program which will soon appear on the Duran, probably need to prepare for a renewal of the conflict between Israel and Iran, which I suspect is probably only months away. But even as that problem of the Middle East remains unresolved, even as the conflict in Ukraine is unresolved, the United States now looks to be preparing for a new intervention, this time in Latin America. I understand that 3 Aegis-class destroyers are being deployed to the Venezuelan coast, supposedly to deal with drug traffickers. If you really believe that you deploy Aegis-class, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers to deal with drug traffickers, then I absolutely have a bridge to sell you, if you really believe that. And of course, the Venezuelan government is clearly talking about the possibility of an American attack on Venezuela, and that is entirely possible. I am baffled by this. It is true that President Maduro and his government in Venezuela are not on the best of terms with many Latin American governments, including that of President Lula of Brazil, for example. But if the United States, the administration, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, and the rest believe that Latin American opinion is going to welcome an American military intervention in a Latin American country, then they have a lack of knowledge and understanding of modern Latin American history, which leaves me incredulous. The response in Latin America, if there is an American attack in any form against Venezuela, is going to be very negative indeed. Now, that is all I'm going to say about this in this program today. I'll no doubt be returning to this topic in future programs, but this is where I'm going to finish today's program, because I'm about to pack my bags and go to the country with my family, but I'll be returning for more programs from this point on. Thank you again. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you. Again, more from me soon. Have a very good day. Next program from the English countryside. Thank you.